A city of noise, smoke, and ambition. In the speakeasies of Manhattan and the alleys of the Lower East Side, a single name carried both reverence and fear: Lucky Luciano. To the public he was a phantom figure, half myth, half man, the immigrant kid who built an empire from nothing. To the underworld he was something far more dangerous, a master psychologist. Luciano understood what every gangster, every politician, every soldier secretly craved: loyalty. Not loyalty as sentiment but as currency. And in his hands, that currency became his most dangerous weapon. This is not just a story about crime. It's a story about control, the control of men's hearts, ambitions, and fears. Loyalty for Luciano was never about friendship or family. It was about power, invisible, untraceable power. The kind that binds people tighter than chains. The kind that can make a man kill for you, or die for you. In the early decades of the 20th century, America was a land of opportunity for everyone, even criminals. Immigrants flooded Ellis Island with dreams of a better life, but for many, especially the Italian poor, the only door open was the one leading to the streets. Crime wasn't rebellion, it was survival. And in that brutal ecosystem, loyalty became a lifeline. You stood with your people or you were nothing. It was in this world that Salvatore Lucania, the boy who would become Lucky Luciano, learned his first and most valuable lesson. Loyalty could be manufactured. Every empire is built on an illusion, and Luciano's illusion was simple. Make men believe that you care about them and they will serve you as if you were a god. He could read men like books, the insecure, the ambitious, the reckless, the faithful. Where others used the gun, Luciano used trust. He offered his men a vision, not just of wealth, but of belonging. To be loyal to Lucky was to belong to something bigger than yourself. That was his genius. The underworld had seen violent kings before. Men like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, who ruled with fear and superstition. But fear breaks, loyalty bends. Luciano understood that. He didn't just want soldiers, he wanted believers. Every handshake, every deal, every glass of whiskey shared in a dimly lit backroom was part of the performance. He'd look a man in the eye, call him amico, and make him feel indispensable. And that man, without realizing it, had just surrendered a piece of himself. But loyalty, like all power, is double-edged. The deeper the devotion, the greater the potential for betrayal. What makes Luciano's story timeless is not just how he built the Mafia, it's how he built people. He turned a scattered network of street gangs into a corporate structure, an empire governed by rules, codes, and shared profit. But behind that machinery of control lay something far more human: the manipulation of trust. To understand Luciano, you must understand the paradox he lived by. He trusted no one, yet demanded complete trust from everyone. It was both his armor and his curse. His eyes were always watching, calculating, studying the smallest gestures. Who hesitated to answer, who looked away, who smiled too long. He once said, "You can't be too careful who you call a friend." It wasn't paranoia, it was policy. As this story unfolds, you'll see how that policy became the foundation of a new kind of organized crime, one not ruled by tradition but by systems. Luciano didn't just change how the Mafia worked, he changed how power itself was perceived. He made crime efficient, profitable, and almost civilized. Yet beneath the surface of this grand design, the seeds of betrayal were already being sown. The story of Lucky Luciano is the story of a man who believed that loyalty could be controlled like a business transaction. It's the story of how a poor Sicilian immigrant reshaped the moral fabric of America's underworld, and how his greatest weapon ultimately destroyed him. In the end, every empire built on loyalty must face the same truth: devotion can never be owned, only borrowed. And when it's gone, everything else crumbles. So tonight, we step into the smoke and the silence of that lost world, into the jazz-filled nights of prohibition, the whispered deals, the sudden violence, the illusion of friendship. This isn't just a biography, it's an autopsy of power. Because to understand Lucky Luciano is to understand the dangerous psychology of loyalty itself. And how, in the shadows of New York, one man learned to wield it like a knife. Before Lucky Luciano, New York's criminal underworld was a jungle without a king. The city at the turn of the 20th century was bursting at the seams. Immigrants from Italy, Ireland, and Eastern Europe stacked in tenements that smelled of coal dust, sweat, and desperation. Opportunity was scarce. Respect was even scarcer. For the poor, crime wasn't rebellion, it was economy. It was the only system that seemed to work. But that system was chaotic, built on tribalism, superstition, and blood feuds that stretched back to the old country. In this chaos, every neighborhood had its own petty tyrant. The Irish controlled the docks, the Jews dominated the garment racket, and the Italians, recent arrivals with fractured loyalties, turned on one another. The Italian underworld wasn't one empire but a patchwork of clans. Neapolitans, Calabrians and Sicilians each suspicious of the other. Their bosses ruled through brute force and tradition. There was no structure, no cooperation, no long-term vision, just a cycle of revenge. Every murder birthed another vendetta. Every street corner was a war zone. New York's first real gangsters, the ones who predated Luciano, were brawlers not businessmen. Figures like Big Jim Colosimo in Chicago or Joe Masuria in New York didn't think about efficiency or expansion. They ruled through fear, collecting tribute from smaller gangs, enforcing obedience with knives and guns. In their world, loyalty was enforced, not earned. It was a rigid code born from the old Sicilian Mafia, a code where betrayal was punished not with exile but with death. It kept men silent, but it also kept them ignorant. Meanwhile, America was changing. Prohibition was on the horizon, and with it came the greatest business opportunity organized crime had ever seen. Alcohol, once a legal industry, was about to become liquid gold. The streets buzzed with rumors of easy money. Bootlegging empires began to rise, and the criminal world's primitive feuds suddenly collided with something new: capitalism. The problem was the old guard didn't know how to adapt. They fought over territory instead of organizing production. They killed rivals instead of negotiating supply chains. They thought like gangsters, not entrepreneurs. This was the world into which a young Salvatore Lucania arrived. A world divided between brute power and wasted potential. The Mafia families were still ruled by bosses who saw themselves as medieval lords. Loyalty meant servitude, not partnership. To question an order was to invite execution. The Sicilian hierarchy demanded obedience to blood and birthright. A man's worth wasn't measured by his skill or intelligence, but by his ancestry and his willingness to bleed for the cause. But in the back alleys of the Lower East Side, something was changing. A new generation of immigrants, sons of dockworkers and pushcart peddlers, saw the underworld through different eyes. They grew up speaking English, gambling with Jews, running errands for Irish cops. They were Americans in every way except their last names. For them, loyalty wasn't about blood, it was about profit. This generation was learning to blend the traditions of their fathers with the pragmatism of the new world. In the early 1910s and 1920s, Manhattan was teeming with gang activity. The Five Points Gang, the Eastman Gang, the Gophers, each ruled its turf with knives, clubs, and eventually guns. Extortion rackets flourished, brothels paid protection money, illegal gambling dens dotted the Bowery. Yet all of it was small-scale, reactive, impulsive. There was no structure connecting these operations, no vision that extended beyond the next week's take. The gangsters fought for pennies while ignoring the dollars floating in the distance. Even within the Italian circles, power was fragmented. Mustache Pete's, as the younger gangsters mockingly called the old Sicilian dons, clung to outdated values. They trusted only fellow Sicilians, demanded kneeling respect and forbade partnerships with non-Italians. They saw the likes of Jewish or Irish criminals as inferior outsiders. To them, business with such men was dishonor. They didn't see the future, they saw only the past. The police, for their part, didn't know how to handle it. Corruption ran deep, precinct captains took bribes, politicians looked the other way, and judges could be bought with envelopes full of cash. The city's law enforcement was as fractured as the criminal world it tried to control. Every cop on the beat knew who the gangsters were, but arresting one meant dealing with another. Crime wasn't just tolerated, it was integrated. And above it all, the immigrant struggle kept feeding the cycle. In the Lower East Side, kids grew up watching their fathers crushed by factory work or humiliated by landlords who spoke better English. Respect became the most precious commodity, more valuable than money. For many, joining a gang wasn't about greed, it was about dignity. The streets offered a kind of hierarchy that society denied them. You could be a nobody in the daytime world, but at night, with a gun in your pocket and men who called you brother, you were someone. That was the paradox of the old underworld. It promised belonging but thrived on fear. Men swore loyalty to bosses they despised, not out of love but out of terror. Every gesture of trust was shadowed by suspicion. Every alliance was temporary. Loyalty had become a word drained of meaning, until a young Luciano began to see how it could be redefined. He watched the old dons and saw inefficiency, not honor. He saw opportunity in their arrogance, weakness in their obsession with heritage. He realized that loyalty could be turned into something profitable, a contract of mutual benefit rather than blind faith. Before Luciano, the Mafia was tribal. After him it would be corporate. But to reach that transformation the world had to burn first. The street wars, the betrayals, the killings, they were the necessary chaos before the order. Luciano's rise would not begin in peace but in blood, and from that blood he would carve a system that outlasted them all. In that pre-Luciano world loyalty was simple, obey or die. But he would turn it into something far more dangerous, obey and prosper. That small shift in psychology would change everything. It would take the Mafia from the alleys to the boardrooms, from backroom deals to national networks. The world before Luciano was a storm without a center. Soon it would find one. He was born Salvatore Lucania in 1897, in a small Sicilian town called Lercara, a place of dust, superstition, and silence. His father was a sulfur miner, his mother a devout Catholic who prayed that her children might escape poverty. But escape, for the Lucanias, meant leaving everything behind. In 1906, when Salvatore was just 9 years old, the family boarded a ship bound for America, the mythical land of hope, where a man could become anything. When they arrived, the dream met reality. The Lower East Side of Manhattan wasn't a gateway to opportunity, it was a concrete battlefield. The family crammed into a tenement building where rats outnumbered people and the air was thick with coal smoke and desperation. Children played in alleys littered with broken glass and garbage. Work was brutal, life was cheap, and respect was earned only through strength. For a young immigrant boy with broken English and empty pockets, the streets became both teacher and test. Luciano learned quickly. He saw that there were two kinds of people in America, those who took and those who were taken from. At school he fought with Irish boys who mocked his accent. On the streets he ran errands for older kids who paid him in coins and cigarettes. But even as a boy there was something different about Salvatore. He wasn't just a fighter, he was a thinker. He studied people the way others studied scripture. He noticed how the boldest didn't always win, but the clever ones always survived. By the time he was 10 he had his first hustle, charging other kids for protection on the walk home from school. For a nickel a week, Luciano promised that no one would touch them. It wasn't just about intimidation, it was organization. He created a network, divided territories, even offered discounts to kids who brought him new customers. It was primitive business strategy but it worked. When one boy refused to pay, Luciano made an example out of him. The next day no one questioned his authority again. But while many boys his age dreamed of baseball or adventure, Luciano's heroes were men in suits who ran the streets, the gangsters. He'd see them in the corner saloons, slick hair, diamond rings, cigars glowing like embers in the dark. They weren't begging for respect, they commanded it. To a poor immigrant kid they looked like gods. And more importantly they belonged. That word would haunt him for the rest of his life. Around this time he met Meyer Lansky, a sharp-eyed Jewish kid who shared the same street instincts and ambition. The two were opposites, Luciano bold and charming, Lansky quiet and calculating, but they saw something in each other. In a city that divided people by race and language, they recognized that loyalty could cross those lines. Together they began running small-time gambling and extortion rackets, learning that cooperation, not division, was the future of crime. But before he became lucky, Salvatore had to learn about fear, and what it cost. In his late teens he fell in with the 5 Points Gang, one of the city's most notorious outfits, led by the cunning and polished Paul Kelly, Paolo Vaccarelli. Kelly's operation was a school for professional criminals. Here Luciano learned discipline, how to dress well, how to negotiate, how to think beyond the street corner. Kelly wasn't just a thug, he was a businessman of vice. And he saw something in Luciano, the mix of charm and ruthlessness that made him stand out among the rougher kids. Kelly taught him the value of image, that power begins before a word is spoken. Luciano watched how Kelly spoke softly but commanded attention, how he used diplomacy where others used violence. This was a revelation. Power, Luciano realized, didn't always wear a gun, sometimes it wore a smile. He began to cultivate his own persona, the confident, unflappable young man who treated everyone as an equal until they proved unworthy. But the streets didn't reward intelligence alone. In 1923, Luciano was beaten and nearly killed by a group of rival gangsters after refusing to pay protection money. He was left for dead in a ditch on Staten Island. When he woke up in the hospital days later, his face was permanently scarred, a brutal reminder of how fragile life was in his world. From that day forward, the nickname Lucky followed him. Some said he survived by chance. Others said it was destiny. But to Luciano the word had a different meaning: control your luck or someone else will. That beating changed him. It burned out whatever innocence was left and replaced it with purpose. He became more methodical, more cautious, more dangerous. Luck, he decided, was not random, it was the art of preparation meeting opportunity. He would never again rely on anyone else for protection. Instead, he'd build his own network, one based not on blood or heritage but on mutual benefit. By his early 20s, Luciano had already made powerful friends and dangerous enemies. He worked under Arnold Rothstein, the legendary gambler and criminal financier who had fixed the 1919 World Series. Rothstein became Luciano's unofficial mentor, teaching him the rules of modern business: diversification, discretion, and loyalty to profit above all else. It was Rothstein who introduced him to the concept that would define his empire: crime could be systematized. Under Rothstein's guidance, Luciano began thinking in terms of structure. He stopped seeing gangs as disorganized rabble and started seeing them as potential corporations. Each racket, gambling, bootlegging, prostitution, could function like a department. Each man could have a defined role, a cut, and a responsibility. The key to keeping them loyal wasn't fear, it was opportunity. Give a man a stake in the system and he'll protect it with his life. Meanwhile, Luciano's circle expanded. Frank Costello, the smooth-talking political fixer. Vito Genovese, the ruthless enforcer. Bugsy Siegel, the hot-headed visionary. They were the architects of what would soon become America's criminal revolution. Each brought something unique, but Luciano was always the center. The one who understood that power wasn't about being the loudest man in the room, but the one everyone listened to when he finally spoke. The old bosses saw him as a risk, too modern, too Americanized. They called him disrespectful for doing business with Jews and Irishmen. But Luciano didn't care about tradition. The old ways, he once said, are good for museums. He was building something new, something beyond the reach of the mustache-petes who clung to the past. In the backrooms of bars and restaurants, he began forming quiet alliances, talking about a future where every criminal organization could coexist, as long as money flowed and boundaries were respected. It was a radical idea at a time when the only rule was dominance through fear. Yet, in the minds of young men hungry for power, it made sense. They didn't just want to survive, they wanted to build. From a scared boy in the alleys of the Lower East Side, Luciano had transformed into a man who understood the psychology of power. He had learned that loyalty could be engineered, that friendship could be transactional, and that control didn't come from shouting orders. It came from making others believe they shared your dream. He wasn't the richest gangster in New York yet. He wasn't the most feared. But he was the most adaptable. And in the world of crime, as in nature, it's not the strongest who survive but the ones who evolve. Luciano had evolved. And soon he would make the rest of the underworld evolve with him. By the early 1920s, New York was changing fast, and so was Lucky Luciano. The city had become the beating heart of Prohibition America, a place where alcohol was outlawed but more available than ever. The streets pulsed with opportunity. Speakeasies thrived behind every unmarked door, jazz music bled from basements into midnight air, and the police were either too corrupt or too complicit to interfere. It was a city built on contradictions, and Luciano, the clever Sicilian street kid who had learned to read men better than books, saw his opening. He was no longer the scrappy errand boy from the Lower East Side. Under the mentorship of Arnold Rothstein, he had learned how the real money flowed, quietly, invisibly, through connections, influence, and information. Rothstein didn't just teach him how to smuggle liquor. He taught him how to organize chaos. Rothstein's motto was simple: don't fight the law, buy it. That idea would become one of the pillars of Luciano's empire. While most gangsters were still fighting over street corners and cheap whiskey, Luciano envisioned something bigger. A criminal industry, efficient and structured, one that operated with the discipline of a corporation. But to achieve that, he needed people, and not just any people. He needed the right minds, the right loyalty, and the right ambition. He began to build his circle like a general assembling his officers. The first was Meyer Lansky, his old partner from the streets. The two had grown up in the same school of hard lessons, and Lansky's mind for numbers balanced Luciano's instinct for people. Lansky could calculate the risk of a deal faster than most men could count their change. Together they developed a kind of unspoken language. Luciano handled the men, Lansky handled the money. Then came Frank Costello, the smooth operator who specialized in political connections. Costello was the bridge between the underworld and the upper class, the man who could make laws bend with a handshake and a quiet donation. Finally, there was Vito Genovese, cold, ruthless, and absolutely loyal, at least for now. He was Luciano's muscle, the enforcer who kept the rest in line when charm failed. These men would become the foundation of Luciano's empire, not through blood ties but through shared profit. They were bound not by the old codes of Sicily, but by the logic of modern business. For the first time in the Mafia's history, loyalty was not a birthright, it was an investment. Luciano's operation began to take shape during the Prohibition years. He established smuggling routes from Canada and the Caribbean, coordinated shipments with Jewish and Irish partners, and managed a distribution system that stretched from the docks of New York to the speakeasies of Chicago. He wasn't the biggest supplier, but he was the most organized. Every delivery, every payment, every shipment was accounted for. To him, crime wasn't chaos, it was logistics. He built networks with other ambitious young gangsters who shared his vision, including Bugsy Siegel and Albert Anastasia. These men weren't content to live under the old Sicilian bosses, who demanded loyalty but offered no progress. Luciano gave them something the old guard never could, a future. He treated his associates like partners, giving them a cut of the profits, asking for ideas, building trust. And in return they gave him something even more valuable than money, devotion. But Luciano's brilliance wasn't just in organization, it was in understanding psychology. He studied how power worked. The old dons used fear to control men. Luciano used respect. He listened to their problems, remembered their families, made them feel important. To his men he wasn't just a boss, he was someone who understood them. They called him Charlie, not Don, and that difference mattered. He blurred the lines between leadership and friendship, ensuring that loyalty came not from obedience, but from admiration. Yet, beneath the charm there was cold calculation. Luciano always maintained emotional distance. He could laugh with you one night and order your death the next morning if it protected the system. To him, loyalty was a mechanism, not a feeling. He once told an associate, "Everybody's loyal, until they're not. So make sure they need you more than you need them." That was the core of his philosophy. Meanwhile, the old world bosses, men like Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria, watched Luciano's rise with growing suspicion. They saw in him the erosion of their traditions. Masuria was a relic of Sicily, proud, paranoid, and brutal. He believed in absolute obedience and total submission. To him, Luciano's alliances with Jews and Irishmen were acts of betrayal. He reminded Luciano constantly, "We don't trust outsiders." But Luciano no longer saw outsiders, only opportunities. For a while Luciano played along. He smiled at Masuria's jokes, bowed his head at meetings, pretended to be the obedient son. But privately he was already plotting something bigger, the transformation of the Mafia itself. He knew that as long as men like Masuria held power, progress was impossible. The Mafia would remain a collection of feuding tribes, too busy spilling each other's blood to make real money. Luciano's vision was revolutionary, to merge the Mafia's old-world discipline with modern efficiency. He saw how American corporations were run, delegation, boards, profit-sharing, chain of command, and he began to adapt those principles to crime. Each gang could operate independently but contribute to a larger network. Disputes could be settled not with bullets but with meetings. There would be structure, fairness, and above all, profit. He began implementing this model in small ways. He organized territories, set price controls for bootleg liquor, and established informal committees to mediate conflicts. These were the early blueprints of what would later become the Commission, the governing body of organized crime in America. But for now it was just theory, a dangerous dream whispered among men who knew that one wrong word could mean death. Luciano was walking a tightrope. To the younger generation he was a visionary. To the old guard he was a heretic. Every handshake with a non-Italian ally, every independent move chipped away at the traditions that had defined the Mafia for decades. But Luciano wasn't afraid of breaking rules, he was afraid of stagnation. "The world's changing," he told Lansky once. "Either we change with it or we die with it." Prohibition had turned ordinary criminals into millionaires, but it had also turned loyalty into a commodity. Everyone had a price and Luciano knew how to pay it. Bribes flowed to police, judges, politicians, even federal agents. He built an invisible web of favors, one that stretched from City Hall to the speakeasy basement. Everyone who mattered owed him something. And everyone who owed him something became part of his machine. By 1928, Luciano had everything a gangster could want: money, respect, power, and a growing army of loyal men. But beneath the glittering surface, tension was brewing. The old bosses, Masuria and his rival, Salvatore Maranzano, were on a collision course that would ignite the bloodiest mafia war in American history. And at the center of it, balancing between loyalty and ambition, stood Lucky Luciano, the apprentice who had learned all the rules of the old world, just so he could break them. Blood was the language of the old Mafia, and by the end of the 1920s New York was drowning in it. What began as quiet tension between rival bosses exploded into open war. The Castellamarese War, a savage conflict that would decide the future of organized crime in America. On one side stood Joe, the boss Masuria, the self-proclaimed king of the New York underworld, Luciano's mentor, patron, and now his cage. On the other stood Salvatore Maranzano, the old-school Sicilian from Castellammare del Golfo, a man who saw himself as the second coming of Julius Caesar. Between them lay a battlefield of ambition, fear, and betrayal. And right in the middle, caught between two gods demanding loyalty, stood Lucky Luciano. To the outside world he seemed loyal to Masuria. He attended the meetings, paid respect, kissed the ring. But inside, Luciano was growing restless. He'd built his reputation under Joe the boss, running bootlegging and gambling operations, maintaining alliances across ethnic lines. Yet Masuria's rule was suffocating. The man was greedy, paranoid, and blind to the future. He distrusted anyone who wasn't born in Sicily, and he clung to the idea that the Mafia should remain a secret fraternity of pure Sicilians. For Luciano, who had tasted success through cooperation with men like Lansky and Costello, that mindset was poison. Masuria demanded total obedience, but offered nothing in return except fear. Every meeting was a test of loyalty, every silence a potential death sentence. His temper was legendary. Men disappeared over rumors, whispers, or imagined slights. To survive, Luciano became an actor, perfecting the mask of devotion. He laughed at Masuria's jokes, toasted his name, and pretended to share his hatred of the Maranzano faction. But in the privacy of smoky backrooms, he whispered another truth: we can't build an empire in chains. Across town, Salvatore Maranzano watched the younger generation's discontent with sharp eyes. He represented everything the old Mafia cherished: hierarchy, religion, and honor. He preached about loyalty as a sacred code, the bond that kept the men of respect above the common criminal. But behind his sermons, Maranzano was as ambitious and ruthless as Masuria. He wanted not just to defeat his rival, but to become the absolute ruler of the American underworld. To him, the Mafia wasn't an organization, it was a kingdom, and he would be its emperor. Luciano understood that neither of these men could coexist in the world he envisioned. They were relics of a dying age, obsessed with pride and superstition, blind to the logic of progress. He realized something most men in his world never dared to think: loyalty could be flexible. It wasn't a sacred vow, it was a transaction. You gave it to whoever helped you survive, and when that equation changed, so did your loyalty. It was a dangerous philosophy. In a culture built on oaths and omerta, to question the permanence of loyalty was heresy. Yet for Luciano it was simple pragmatism. You can't be loyal to a man who doesn't know how to lead, he confided to Meyer Lansky one night. You be loyal to the idea, to the future. Lansky, ever the rationalist, agreed. Together they began to sketch the outlines of a plan that would end the old Mafia once and for all. But first, Luciano had to survive the war. The Castellamarese War was chaos incarnate. Kidnappings, drive-by shootings, bombings, bodies piled up in alleys, in restaurants, even in cars stopped at red lights. No one was safe. Luciano, trying to maintain his balancing act, pretended to fight for Masuria while secretly reaching out to Maranzano's people. Both sides suspected him. Both sides needed him. It was the perfect position for a man who played the long game. Then came the moment that defined his philosophy forever. One night in 1930, Luciano was kidnapped by unknown men, beaten, stabbed, and dumped on a beach in Staten Island. He survived, barely, crawling his way back to the city. Rumor spread that the kidnapping had been ordered by Masuria himself, testing Luciano's loyalty. Whether true or not, it planted a seed of cold certainty in his mind. In this world, loyalty was a lie unless it served your survival. That near-death experience hardened him. The charm remained, but the warmth behind it vanished. From then on, Luciano treated loyalty as a tool, not a virtue. He realized that fear could make men obey, but only opportunity could make them truly committed. To win this war, he wouldn't fight with bullets, he'd fight with psychology. Luciano quietly began meeting with Maranzano's emissaries. He offered a deal: end the war, remove Masuria, and Luciano would bring his network, his men, his influence, his American-born allies, under Maranzano's command. In return, he wanted freedom, the right to modernize the Mafia, to form partnerships beyond Sicily, to bring structure and profit where chaos reigned. Maranzano, sensing an opportunity, agreed. The deal was sealed with deceit. Luciano returned to Masuria's side, acting the loyal lieutenant until the moment came. On April 15, 1931, he invited Joe the Boss to a card game at Nuova Villa Tomorrow, a restaurant in Coney Island. They ate, they laughed, they played cards. Then Luciano excused himself to the bathroom. Minutes later, gunmen, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, Bugsy Siegel, and Vito Genovese, walked in and opened fire. When Luciano returned, Masuria was slumped over the table, a cigarette still burning in his fingers, the ace of spades on the floor beside him. The war, for all practical purposes, was over. It was one of the most symbolic murders in American Mafia history, not just because of who died but because of what it meant. Luciano had killed not just a man but an era. The world of blind loyalty, of tribal obedience, of unquestioned authority, all of it ended with the echo of those gunshots. For the first time, power had shifted from the old world bosses to the new generation. In the immediate aftermath, Maranzano assumed control of New York. True to his word, he rewarded Luciano with power and territory. He even began restructuring the Mafia, dividing it into families, and appointing himself as Capo di Tutti Capi, the boss of all bosses. To the public it looked like order had finally come. But Luciano saw something else, a mirror image of Masuria, dressed in finer suits and quoting Roman history, but just as blinded by ego. He had traded one master for another. It was a bitter revelation. Luciano had betrayed Masuria to free himself from tyranny, only to find himself under another ruler who believed loyalty meant submission. Maranzano demanded weekly tributes, inspected operations, and surrounded himself with Sicilian loyalists who viewed Luciano's multi-ethnic alliances as heresy. The dream of a modern, businesslike underworld seemed to be slipping away. But Luciano had learned his lesson. Loyalty to him was no longer a moral bond, it was a weapon to be wielded, a tool to be used and when necessary discarded. He had betrayed once, he could betray again. Because in the new world he envisioned, power wasn't earned through faith. It was engineered through control. And so, as Maranzano basked in his new empire, Lucky Luciano began quietly plotting again, not for survival this time but for supremacy. He had used loyalty to destroy one king. Soon he would use betrayal to build his own crown. By 1931, New York's underworld was exhausted. The Castellamarese War had bled the city dry and everyone, from street soldiers to million-dollar racketeers, wanted peace. Lucky Luciano, now the quiet victor, understood that blood could no longer be the foundation of power. What came next had to be built not on fear but on structure. And so, he set about creating something the world had never seen before, an underworld corporation. In the months following Joe Masuria's assassination and Maranzano's brief reign, Luciano moved like a man possessed. When Maranzano was murdered by Luciano's own order, it marked the final shift in authority. For the first time, there was no single boss of bosses. The old pyramid of domination had been flattened into a boardroom of equals. Luciano established what he called the Commission, a council of the most powerful mafia families, each controlling its own territory but bound by mutual profit and rules of arbitration. Violence would now be a last resort, not the first. This was revolution disguised as order. At the core of this new empire was a philosophy that echoed the industrial titans of the age: Rockefeller, Ford, Morgan. Luciano had no interest in chaos, he wanted efficiency. Each family was like a company with divisions, managers, and silent investors. Soldiers became employees, capos became department heads. The commission functioned as a board of directors, settling disputes, approving ventures, and ensuring that no one man could plunge the mafia into another destructive war. This idea of organized crime wasn't new, but Luciano perfected it. Where others saw crime as rebellion, he saw it as business. He once remarked to a friend, "We're businessmen, our commodity just happens to be illegal." The structure he built mirrored legitimate corporations down to the smallest detail. He instituted standardized tribute systems, set profit margins for rackets, and introduced bookkeeping practices to track money flow. Even murder became bureaucratic. Killings had to be approved by higher authorities to prevent unnecessary heat from the police. But what made Luciano truly dangerous wasn't his business model, it was his understanding of human nature. He knew that loyalty could not be demanded indefinitely. It had to be earned, maintained, and monetized. Luciano surrounded himself with men who shared his pragmatism. Frank Costello, the political brain, managed their relationships with judges and politicians. Meyer Lansky, the financial genius, built networks that stretched from Havana to Las Vegas. Bugsy Siegel, brash and fearless, became the spearhead for new ventures in gambling and construction. Together, they formed what journalists later called the combination, an interracial, interethnic partnership that defied the old mafia traditions. To the Sicilian purists, it was blasphemy. But to Luciano it was survival. He had learned that loyalty to blood was fragile. It vanished the moment profit or pride interfered. But loyalty to money, that was eternal. As long as everyone made their cut, peace held. The empire expanded fast. With prohibition still in effect, bootlegging remained the golden vein of income. Luciano controlled shipments from Canada, the Caribbean, and Europe, coordinating with Jewish, Irish, and Italian syndicates. He built a logistics network that rivaled legitimate corporations. Trucks, warehouses, distributors, all under his control. Each deal was protected by the police and politicians he paid off, each dollar washed through front businesses and union contracts. Then came gambling. Luciano saw that Americans didn't just want alcohol, they wanted escape. From Harlem numbers games to high-roller casinos, he turned vice into an industry. Every illegal operation became part of a diversified portfolio. The Mafia, once a loose network of thugs, now functioned like a multinational conglomerate. And through it all, Luciano preached one principle: make money, not headlines. He hated unnecessary violence. Public murders drew police heat, investigations disrupted profits. Discipline, secrecy, and stability became sacred. He didn't want his men to think like gangsters, he wanted them to think like executives. Those who couldn't adapt were removed, quietly and efficiently. To enforce this new order, he implemented a system of checks and balances. Each family was autonomous but accountable. Disputes went before the commission, a council that included bosses like Vincent Mangano, Joe Prophesci, Tommy Gagliano, and Al Capone's Chicago outfit. It was, in essence, the Mafia's version of the United Nations. For a time it worked beautifully. Violence dropped, profits soared, and for the first time in history, the American underworld operated like a single organism. Luciano became a king without a crown, the quiet hand that steered the entire nation's criminal economy. But beneath this illusion of order lay something far more profound: a psychological machine. Luciano wasn't just organizing crime, he was engineering human behavior. He understood that men feared chaos more than anything. By giving them structure, roles, ranks, and stability, he transformed killers into loyal employees. He used loyalty as architecture, not morality. He didn't demand love or fear, he offered identity. In a world that offered no legitimate path to power for immigrants, the Mafia became a mirror of the American dream, brutal but structured. Every rule he created had a purpose beyond efficiency. When he banned kidnappings, it wasn't out of mercy, it was because kidnappings attracted the FBI. When he outlawed drug dealing within the ranks, it wasn't moralism, it was brand protection. Keep the business clean, he said, and they'll never know how deep it goes. He also introduced something the old bosses never understood: delegation. Luciano rarely appeared in person at violent meetings or public gatherings. He worked through proxies, cultivating an aura of calm authority. When he spoke, he didn't shout. He reasoned. That tone, rational, modern, unflinching, made men obey not out of fear but out of belief. But perhaps his greatest innovation was how he redefined loyalty itself. To him, it was not blind obedience but mutual dependency. Everyone under him had something to lose if the system failed. Their livelihoods, their safety, their families, all tied to the smooth operation of Luciano's structure. Loyalty became self-interest institutionalized. In that sense, Luciano was not just a criminal genius, he was a social engineer. He took the immigrant chaos of New York's underworld and gave it form, logic, and hierarchy. He replaced superstition with business, replaced fear with contracts, and replaced blood oaths with shared profits. The transformation was so complete that even law enforcement had trouble keeping up. The old model, where one boss controlled one neighborhood, no longer applied. The Mafia had become decentralized, invisible, and self-regulating. Luciano's empire didn't need thrones or ceremonies, it lived in the flow of money. Yet, as history always proves, every empire sows the seeds of its own undoing. By creating a structure that depended on mutual trust, Luciano also created countless opportunities for betrayal. The very system that protected him, the same system that kept bloodshed at bay, would one day turn against him. But for now, in the early 1930s, Lucky Luciano had done the impossible. He had transformed the Mafia from a secret brotherhood of killers into a corporate entity of criminals, bound not by heritage, but by efficiency and profit. He was no longer just a mobster. He was a CEO of crime. And in that sleek, disciplined empire, one rule governed all: loyalty was currency, and Lucky Luciano controlled the mint. As Luciano's new empire settled into place, the air in New York's underworld changed. For the first time, peace seemed possible. The Commission had ended the old wars, profits were rising, and the Mafia, once a fragmented network of immigrant gangs, now operated like a corporation under one quiet ruler. But beneath that veneer of order, something dangerous was brewing. Ambition, jealousy, and suspicion, the timeless poisons of power, began to creep back into the bloodstream of the organization. Lucky Luciano had built a system where loyalty replaced violence, where money replaced blood. But as the money grew, so did the egos. Every boss wanted more. Every ally wondered who might betray whom first. The Commission that had promised balance soon became an arena of subtle war, fought not with bullets but with whispers, alliances, and betrayals. And in the center of it all was Luciano himself, calm and calculating, navigating the fragile network he had created. His closest allies, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and Bugsy Siegel, stood with him as his modernist inner circle. Together they understood the new order, that power wasn't about territory anymore but influence. Lansky managed finances, Costello handled politics, and Siegel enforced discipline on the streets. Each of them owed their fortunes to Luciano, but none were bound to him by fear. They followed him because he represented progress. But not everyone shared their vision. The old guard bosses, men like Vincent Mangano, Joe Prophesy, and Joe Bonanno, resented Luciano's Americanized ways. They distrusted his partnerships with Jews and Irishmen, his sleek suits, his disdain for Sicilian ceremony. To them, he wasn't a true man of honor. He was an opportunist. Worse, they feared he was growing too powerful, controlling the Commission from the shadows, influencing decisions far beyond his own family's borders. And in truth he was. Luciano had designed the Commission as a democracy on paper, but in practice he was its chairman, the man whose approval made or broke careers. His charm masked his control. He gave advice, not orders, but those who ignored that advice often found themselves replaced or eliminated. It was a delicate act of political theater, rule through persuasion, not decree. But as the Mafia expanded, that balance became harder to maintain. Tensions began to flare over territory and business. The Chicago outfit wanted more control over Midwestern bootlegging routes. The Detroit partnership demanded independence in narcotics. Even within New York, lines blurred between families as smuggling operations overlapped. Small disputes became tests of power, and every resolution, no matter how minor, set a precedent. Luciano handled each crisis with the calm precision of a CEO. When two captains from rival families clashed over a shipment, he didn't send gunmen, he sent accountants. "Who's losing money here?" he would ask. "Fix that and the problem disappears." He believed that every feud had an economic root, and for a while that belief worked. But the real threat didn't come from outside the system. It came from within. By the mid-1930s, Luciano's empire had grown so large that it attracted the attention of law enforcement, reformers, and political opportunists. The public saw a new breed of gangster, smooth, untouchable, invisible. To politicians looking for headlines, Luciano became the perfect target. And no one seized that opportunity like Thomas E. Dewey, a young, ambitious special prosecutor determined to clean up New York. Dewey was brilliant, relentless, and photogenic, the kind of man newspapers adored. His mission was simple: bring down the Mafia by cutting off its financial arteries. Dewey's crusade created a ripple of fear across the underworld. Cops raided gambling parlors, seized records, and arrested bookies. Union bosses were questioned, politicians grilled. For the first time, Luciano's empire felt the tremor of real vulnerability. Inside the Commission, panic spread. The bosses, always paranoid, began to question Luciano's leadership. "If we're supposed to be invisible," one reportedly said, "why is the government saying his name in the papers?" The irony was cruel. The very system Luciano had built to prevent chaos now saw him as the cause of it. Meanwhile, alliances began to shift. Some of Luciano's closest associates started whispering to save themselves. Vito Genovese, his ambitious underboss, saw Dewey's investigation as a sign of weakness, and an opportunity. Genovese had always envied Luciano's charisma and authority. He was the type who believed loyalty was temporary, power eternal. To him, Luciano's style, his diplomacy, his restraint, looked like softness. Behind closed doors, Genovese began positioning himself for the future. He reached out to old Sicilian bosses, promising a return to tradition once Luciano was gone. To the Commission he spoke of loyalty and unity, To his men he spoke of revolution. It was the same playbook Luciano himself had used against Mafia years before. But Lucky wasn't blind. He knew betrayal when he saw it. He had invented its modern form. He let Genovese talk, let him think he was untouchable. All the while, Luciano continued building his political shield, deepening ties with Costello's network of judges, cops and Tammany Hall fixers. To outsiders, the Mafia was a criminal syndicate. But to Luciano, it was a parallel government, complete with its own economy and justice system. At the same time, Meyer Lansky began expanding the empire beyond America's borders. In Cuba and the Caribbean he saw a future free from U.S. law enforcement. Luciano approved, quietly funding casino ventures and money laundering operations. It was an early glimpse of globalization, crime without borders, loyalty without nation. But as the empire grew more complex, Luciano found himself surrounded by contradictions. He was a man who prized loyalty but built his power on betrayal. He preached order but thrived on manipulation. His enemies accused him of being too soft. His allies whispered that he had become too paranoid. Every meeting of the commission became a chessboard, every handshake a calculation. And yet, in public, Luciano remained the picture of composure. He attended nightclubs, mingled with politicians and even appeared in society columns. To the public he was a mysterious figure, a man of wealth and taste whose past was always just out of reach. But behind that charm the paranoia was growing. He began rotating safe houses, changing cars and limiting meetings. For a man who had mastered the art of control, it was the first sign of fear. The cracks widened in 1935, when a series of raids targeted his prostitution operations in Manhattan. Luciano had always considered prostitution beneath him, a dirty, unstable business. But many of his subordinates ran it behind his back, paying him protection money. When Dewey's office linked those brothels directly to Luciano, the headlines were explosive. "Lucky Luciano, king of vice," screamed the papers. The narrative was set. A criminal emperor exploiting women, running a moral plague through the city. It didn't matter that most of the evidence was circumstantial, or that Luciano rarely touched the operations himself. The image was too perfect, too cinematic for the public to resist. Inside the underworld, however, a different story circulated. Many whispered that the investigation was helped along by insiders, men eager to see Luciano fall so they could claim his throne. Even Meyer Lansky suspected Genovese's hand in leaking information to Dewey's office. Whether or not it was true, Luciano understood the message. His era of untouchability was ending. Still he played it cool. When questioned by reporters he smiled. "They call me a gangster," he said, "but I'm just a businessman." It was classic Luciano, turning accusation into irony. But beneath the smirk he knew the game was shifting. The loyalty he had so carefully engineered was now fracturing under pressure. The alliances that once protected him were crumbling into self-preservation. He had built a machine that made men rich, but in doing so he had also taught them how to think like him. And in that mirror of ambition, loyalty no longer belonged to anyone. In the coming storm, Lucky Luciano would face the test of his own creation. Could loyalty, once weaponized, ever truly be trusted? Or had he built an empire destined to eat itself alive? By 1935, the empire Lucky Luciano had built, the sleek, invisible machine of organized crime, was beginning to tremble under the weight of its own perfection. For years, he had ruled like a silent monarch, his authority unquestioned, his presence almost mythic. But now the shadows were closing in. Newspapers were filled with headlines about corruption, brothels, and racketeering. Politicians, desperate to appear righteous in an age of scandal, had found their villain. And at the center of that storm stood one name, Charles Lucky Luciano. To the public he was the devil in silk. To his men he was still the boss, the man who had built order from chaos. But within the empire itself, whispers began to replace respect. Some said Luciano had lost his edge. Others said he was too distracted, too visible. And behind those whispers the invisible war had already begun. The first blow came from Thomas E. Dewey, the young special prosecutor appointed to clean up New York's underworld. Dewey wasn't just another cop, he was a strategist, a man with a sense of theater. He understood that to destroy the Mafia, he couldn't simply arrest gangsters. He had to dismantle their mythology. And so, he made Luciano his symbol, the embodiment of corruption, decadence, and power without conscience. In truth, Luciano had little direct involvement in the prostitution business Dewey would use to destroy him. His empire had long since moved into more lucrative and less visible ventures, gambling, unions, narcotics, and real estate. But Dewey didn't need facts. He needed a narrative. In early 1936, raids began across Manhattan and Brooklyn. Brothels were hit, madams arrested, and bookkeepers dragged from their homes in the middle of the night. The police worked off lists provided by Dewey's investigators, lists that, mysteriously, included names and addresses that could only have come from inside the Mafia. Luciano suspected betrayal. And he was right. His underboss, Vito Genovese, had been quietly feeding information to various sources, positioning himself as the loyal soldier, ready to step in if Luciano fell. Genovese had learned from the master how to betray with patience, how to disguise ambition as loyalty. Every empire, after all, creates its own Judas. Luciano's instinct for survival kicked in. He met with Lansky and Costello, trying to assess the scale of the danger. "Dewey's just a lawyer," he said at first. "He'll make noise then move on." But Lansky, ever the realist, warned him otherwise. "This guy's not after arrests," Lansky said. "He's after headlines. And your name sells papers." Meanwhile, Dewey's case was growing. He turned the women arrested in the raids, some terrified, some vengeful, into witnesses. They painted Luciano as a puppet master, the man who taxed every brothel, who decided who lived and who died in the vice world. Dewey's office even orchestrated dramatic courtroom testimonies, where trembling witnesses described being beaten, threatened, or protected by Luciano's men. Luciano, watching from the sidelines, understood the trap. The law didn't need to prove his guilt, they only needed to make the story believable. And in America, a story told well enough could destroy any man, even one who had built an empire on silence. The pressure inside his organization began to fracture. Some captains went underground, others fled. Luciano's usual shield, his network of politicians and police on the payroll, suddenly evaporated. Dewey had made corruption itself a public target. Anyone seen protecting Luciano risked exposure. The alliances that once kept him invincible now became liabilities. The once loyal men began making deals of their own. "Just business," they said, echoing Luciano's own philosophy back at him. It was a bitter irony. He had taught them to prioritize survival over sentiment, and now they were using that same logic against him. By mid-1936, Luciano was cornered. Dewey's men raided his suite at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, a lavish hideaway where the boss of bosses had lived like royalty. They found custom-tailored suits, fine liquor, imported cigars, the spoils of his reign. The press feasted on it. Headlines called him the Lord of the Underworld. Luciano fled to Hot Springs, Arkansas, a quiet resort town where mobsters often hid under assumed names. He still had money, influence, and friends in every state. But what he didn't realize was that Dewey had already reached across state lines, persuading local law enforcement to cooperate. On April 1, 1936, the unthinkable happened. Lucky Luciano was arrested. The newspapers turned it into a spectacle. "Lucky caught in the South," blared one front page. Crowds gathered outside police stations, hoping for a glimpse of the man who had ruled New York from the shadows. To the public he was less a criminal and more a fallen king. A man too bold, too cunning, finally brought to justice. But to Luciano it was just another war, one fought not with guns but with lawyers, prosecutors, and headlines. As he was extradited back to New York, Luciano maintained his composure. He smiled for the cameras, waved at reporters, even joked with detectives. "I'm just on vacation," he quipped. That cool defiance made him look untouchable, but inside he was calculating. Every move, every statement, was a performance designed to protect his empire from panic. Meanwhile, Dewey's investigation intensified. In private meetings he promised the public something no prosecutor had ever delivered: the total dismantling of organized vice in New York. And Luciano was the trophy that would make his career. The hidden war wasn't just between Dewey and Luciano, it was between two visions of power. Dewey believed in the authority of law, in order through exposure. Luciano believed in control through invisibility. The prosecutor sought truth, the mobster sought equilibrium. Both men understood influence, manipulation, and psychology, but only one could win in the public eye. Luciano's allies scrambled. Lansky worked behind the scenes trying to bribe officials or sway public opinion. Costello reached out to political contacts. Even Siegel offered to take care of witnesses. But Luciano refused. "No blood," he said. "Not now." He knew killing witnesses would only prove Dewey's point. Still, the betrayal haunted him. From the brothel madams to his own underboss, men and women who had once toasted his name were now testifying against him. Each courtroom session became an execution, not of his life but of his myth. In those days Luciano's smile began to fade. He had spent years mastering the art of calm, of appearing unshaken even when surrounded by danger. But for the first time he was forced to admit something terrifying: he was losing control. In his world, control was everything. It was the glue that held loyalty, power, and respect together. Without it, even fear became meaningless. He had built an empire on logic and rules, but now he was trapped in a system where logic didn't matter. The courtroom was not a boardroom. Dewey wasn't an opponent to negotiate with. He was a man building his own legend on Luciano's downfall. As 1936 wore on, the hidden war reached its climax. Dewey's campaign became national news. Every day more witnesses took the stand. Every day the story grew darker, more sensational. Luciano could feel the tide turning against him, not because the evidence was solid but because the narrative was too perfect. The immigrant gangster who had corrupted a city, the suave devil finally facing justice. By June the jury deliberated. The verdict came swiftly: guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison, effectively a life sentence. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, Luciano simply nodded. "Let's get it over with," he said. No anger, no plea. Just resignation, the calm acceptance of a man who had always known that even kings must fall. But as the courtroom emptied, a single thought burned in his mind: the game wasn't over. Power didn't vanish in a prison cell, it just changed shape. He would find a way to adapt. He always did. And deep down, as the doors of Sing Sing prison closed behind him, Lucky Luciano understood something chilling. In the hidden war between loyalty and survival, he had finally been beaten at his own game. The day Lucky Luciano walked into Sing Sing prison, the silence that followed him was almost reverent. He was 38 years old, young for a man who had already ruled the most powerful criminal organization in America. Reporters described him as calm, expressionless, detached. But those who looked closer saw something else: calculation. Behind the cold eyes of the fallen king, gears were already turning. Luciano had always believed that power didn't disappear, it simply changed address. The headlines screamed his downfall. Lucky Luciano, the untouchable, finally falls. To the public his story seemed finished. The mighty had fallen, justice had won, and the great American experiment had proven that no man, not even a Mafia emperor, was above the law. Dewey was hailed as a hero. Politicians toasted his victory. The papers portrayed Luciano's conviction as the death of organized crime. But behind prison walls, Luciano was already adapting. He understood something that most men never did: survival was about control, not freedom. So when the iron doors closed, he didn't rage or sulk. He studied. He observed. And slowly he began to build a new kind of empire, one that existed in whispers, not headlines. At first, Sing Sing's guards treated him like any other inmate. But it didn't take long before Luciano's charm and discipline began to shift the atmosphere. He kept to himself, dressed neatly, never complained. He respected the routine, but subtly influenced it. Prisoners who had once fought for scraps of food now deferred to him. Guards who once barked orders began to nod politely. Within months, Luciano had created what journalists later called a gentleman's syndicate, inside the walls of one of America's toughest prisons. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. From his cell, Luciano maintained quiet contact with the outside world. Through lawyers, visiting relatives, and coded letters, he kept lines open with Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky. They were his eyes and ears on the street, ensuring that the empire ran smoothly. Costello handled politics and unions. Lansky oversaw finances and investments. Luciano gave them one instruction: keep things calm. Make money. Don't make noise. It was the same principle he had ruled by on the outside, and it worked. The commission continued to function, now more discreet than ever. Luciano's orders traveled invisibly through layers of intermediaries, disguised as legal correspondence or prison gossip. Even behind bars, his words still carried weight. Men on the streets whispered that Charlie's still running things. But it wasn't just management that occupied Luciano's mind. It was reflection. Prison stripped away the noise. For the first time, Luciano had time to think about his choices, his betrayals, his philosophy of loyalty. He replayed the old wars in his mind: Masuria, Maranzano, Genovese. Each had fallen because they trusted the wrong people or clung too tightly to outdated ideals. He wondered if he was any different. He had treated loyalty like a business transaction, a currency to be exchanged, and now, sitting alone in a gray cell, he began to see the cost. He had created a system too perfect, too rational. A world without loyalty bred only ambition. And ambition, unchecked, always turned inward. Still, remorse wasn't in his nature. Luciano didn't see himself as a villain or a victim. In his mind, he had simply played the game of power better than anyone else, until the rules changed. "You don't cry over cards you lose," he reportedly told another inmate. "You just learn to play the next hand smarter." And soon, that next hand arrived, in the most unexpected way. In 1942, America entered World War II. The nation was gripped by fear of espionage and sabotage, especially along the eastern seaboard. German submarines prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships and threatening supply lines. Then came the SS Normandy incident, a luxury French liner docked in New York harbor that mysteriously caught fire and capsized in 1942. The government suspected sabotage. The Navy panicked. They needed help securing the docks, but the waterfront was Mafia territory. Longshoremen, unions, and dock bosses all answered, directly or indirectly, to the same invisible power structure that Luciano had built. The military couldn't trust its own people to keep the docks safe from foreign agents. But they could trust fear, and the one man everyone in that world still obeyed. So, through a web of intermediaries, the U.S. government approached the unthinkable, a secret deal with Lucky Luciano. The operation was codenamed Operation Underworld. Officials met quietly with Luciano's lawyer, Moses Polikoff, offering a bargain. If Luciano could use his influence to ensure there would be no sabotage, no strikes, and full cooperation from the dockworkers and unions, his sentence might be reduced. To Luciano it was a gift from fate. The same government that had branded him a monster now needed his help. "Even the law," he said later, "does business when it has to." From his prison cell, Luciano gave the order. Word traveled through Costello and Lansky to the docks, to the foreman, to the longshoremen who handled every crate and rope. Within weeks, the waterfront was quiet. No strikes, no fires, no German infiltrators. The Navy got its security, and Luciano got something far more valuable: relevance. He was back in the game. When the war ended, government officials quietly recommended clemency for Luciano, citing his wartime cooperation. It wasn't just gratitude, it was an acknowledgement that the man in the cell still wielded power no agency could replicate. But the victory was bittersweet. While Luciano had maintained control, his absence had changed the landscape. Vito Genovese, who had fled to Italy during the war, was maneuvering to reclaim power. Other bosses, emboldened by Luciano's imprisonment, began asserting independence. The commission still respected him, but the respect was fading into myth. Luciano sensed it. "They still call me boss," he once said, "but they're talking to a ghost." His health began to deteriorate: ulcers, fatigue, depression. Yet even then he refused to show weakness. He read newspapers daily, studied business trends, and asked visitors for updates on Cuba and Havana, places he dreamed of one day returning to. Outside, his name became legend. Movies, pulp novels, and tabloids painted him as the mastermind of modern organized crime, half demon, half genius. Dewey had made him infamous, but infamy had a strange way of preserving power. The more the world mythologized Lucky Luciano, the more untouchable he became in spirit. By 1945, he had served nearly a decade behind bars when the political tide began to shift. New York's governor, Thomas E. Dewey, the very man who had once prosecuted him, was now being pressured to consider his release. The war was over, and the Mafia's cooperation with U.S. intelligence had given Luciano a strange kind of legitimacy. After months of deliberation, Dewey agreed to commute Luciano's sentence, on one condition: he would be deported to Italy. It was the end of an era. On February 2, 1946, Lucky Luciano walked out of Great Meadow Prison. Reporters swarmed him, snapping photos as he smiled faintly and raised his hand in farewell. "I did what I had to do," he told one of them. "Now I'm going home." But as the ship carried him across the Atlantic, Luciano wasn't thinking about home. He was thinking about power, about how to rebuild it from exile. He had survived prison. He had outlasted betrayal. And he had turned even the U.S. government into an unwitting ally. The world thought he was finished. But Lucky Luciano wasn't a man who vanished quietly. He was a man who understood that every downfall was just a new beginning, and his next move would prove that even in exile, the ghost of a king could still rule an empire. The trial of Lucky Luciano in 1936 was less a courtroom proceeding and more a public execution disguised as justice. It was theater, the kind designed to cleanse a city's conscience. The press crowded every inch of the Manhattan courtroom, their flashbulbs exploding like gunfire each time Luciano was let in, impeccably dressed, expressionless, and unbothered. Thomas E. Dewey, young and ambitious, stood before the jury like a crusader. He wasn't just prosecuting a man, he was prosecuting a myth. Dewey's case rested on testimony from women, prostitutes who claimed that Luciano's men had controlled them through threats and violence, forcing them to hand over their earnings. It was a fragile web of accusations, but Dewey wielded it masterfully. Each woman told her story with a blend of fear and performance, describing an invisible chain that stretched all the way up to Charlie Lucky. The jurors, unaccustomed to the world of vice and corruption, listened in horror. Luciano's lawyers countered with cold logic. They argued that their client was being tried for his reputation, not for any provable act. "There is not a single witness," one defense attorney said, "who can place Mr. Luciano in any of these rooms, or prove that he ever gave such an order." But Dewey wasn't after proof, he was after perception. He painted Luciano as the invisible hand behind every vice in New York, the spider at the center of a vast criminal web. The jury didn't stand a chance. Each day newspapers printed sensational headlines, "The Vice King of New York Exposed," and "Luciano's Empire of Shame." Outside the courthouse, citizens cheered Dewey as a hero cleaning up the streets. Inside, Luciano remained eerily calm, smoking, listening, occasionally smirking when witnesses stumbled. It was as though he already knew the outcome. When Dewey gave his closing argument, he turned from prosecutor to preacher. "This man," he said, pointing at Luciano, "has corrupted our women, our police, and our city. He has hidden behind layers of intimidation and deceit. But today the law sees through that. Today we tear away the mask." The jury deliberated for only 8 hours before returning with a verdict: guilty on all counts. Luciano stood silently as the judge read the sentence: 30 to 50 years in state prison. No gasp, no outburst. Just a nod, as if acknowledging the end of one chapter and the quiet start of another. Reporters wrote that he looked like a man who had expected nothing less. Dewey basked in the glory. Overnight, he became a national figure, the fearless prosecutor who had taken down the most powerful gangster in America. For Luciano, it was the perfect irony. He had spent his life building an empire that operated in the shadows, and now it was destroyed not by bullets or betrayal, but by the bright light of public spectacle. Yet, behind that calm mask, Luciano was thinking ahead. He knew trials were temporary, systems were eternal. His physical body might have been caged, but his influence, the structure he built, would continue. He had designed it that way. As he was led away in handcuffs, one reporter shouted, "Lucky, any last words?" Luciano paused, turned slightly, and said with a faint grin, "Tell Dewey I'll see him again, one way or another." The courtroom roared with laughter, but those who knew Luciano's mind understood the subtext. He didn't mean revenge. He meant inevitability. Systems like his didn't die, they simply adapted. And even from behind bars, Lucky Luciano would prove that a man who understood loyalty and power could never truly be defeated. When Lucky Luciano entered Clinton Correctional Facility, known as Dannemora, the Siberia of the East, he wasn't just a prisoner, he was a paradox. The man who had once ruled New York's criminal empire now slept on a narrow cot, ate from a tin tray, and woke to the clang of iron gates. But beneath that routine, beneath the monotony of prison life, Luciano was still orchestrating, still commanding an empire from a cage. In the beginning, his enemies expected him to break. Isolation was supposed to destroy men like him, proud, powerful, accustomed to control. But Luciano was different. He understood that true power didn't depend on geography, it depended on influence. And influence, even in prison, could be bought, built, and maintained. He began by observing. The guards, the routines, the hierarchy among inmates, it was all a system no different from the one he'd run on the streets. Within weeks, he had learned who could be trusted, who could be bought, and who needed to be reminded that even here he was Lucky Luciano. Cigarettes became currency, favors became investments. Guards who once barked orders now lingered near his cell, eager for a quiet conversation, a whispered promise. He never bullied or threatened, he managed. That was his gift. He treated prison like a business department temporarily relocated. Soon, Luciano had his own crew within the walls, not criminals planning escapes, but men exchanging news, managing correspondence, and ensuring that the outside world still heard his voice. Communication became his weapon. Through lawyers, family visits, and coded letters, Luciano remained in touch with Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky, his most trusted allies. Costello handled politics, keeping corrupt city officials and judges aligned. Lansky managed finances, laundering money through Cuba and legitimate enterprises. Luciano was the strategist, the thinker, the quiet center of the storm. From his small cell, he approved deals, mediated disputes, and even advised on murders, always indirectly, always through intermediaries. Prison officials suspected he still controlled parts of the Mafia, but they could never prove it. To the outside world, he was a convicted man serving hard time. In reality, he was still the CEO of organized crime, running a multinational empire through whispers and loyalty. But power behind bars wasn't just about command, it was about psychological mastery. Luciano began to study men, their fears, their motivations. He listened more than he spoke. Inmates who were violent or broken found in him a strange sense of authority. Charlie was different, one former inmate later said. He didn't act like he was better than you, but you always knew he was. That quiet charisma made him untouchable. Even among murderers and thieves, Luciano commanded respect. When fights broke out, he ended them with a look. When tensions rose between Italian and Irish inmates, he negotiated peace, not out of kindness but to maintain order. To Luciano, control was serenity. Yet, despite his calm surface, prison forced him to confront something he had long avoided, his own myth. Outside, newspapers called him the father of organized crime. Inside, he was just another number. The contrast gnawed at him. At night, he lay awake replaying the years that had led him here, the alliances, the betrayals, the endless hunger for power. He realized that what had built his empire was not violence or cunning, but loyalty as leverage. Every man he had ever elevated owed him something. Every favor, every debt was a thread in the web he had spun. But now, with him locked away, those threads were loosening. The world he had created, one of silent obedience and structured crime, was beginning to evolve without him. By 1942, the world outside his cell had changed completely. America was at war. German submarines prowled the Atlantic, and New York's docks, long controlled by the Mafia, became a national security concern. Ships caught fire mysteriously, cargo went missing, whispers of Nazi sabotage spread. The government, desperate for control, faced a problem it couldn't solve through official channels. Then someone remembered, Lucky Luciano still held the loyalty of the docks. Through secret intermediaries, U.S. Naval intelligence approached him with an offer, the now famous Operation Underworld. If Luciano could ensure the safety of New York's docks, prevent strikes, and guarantee cooperation among longshoremen, his sentence could be reconsidered. The Navy needed order, and only one man could deliver it. Luciano accepted without hesitation. He didn't see it as redemption, he saw it as business. Everyone's got a price, he reportedly said. Even Uncle Sam. From within prison walls, Luciano orchestrated the entire operation. Through Costello and Lansky, he sent word to dock bosses and union leaders. The message was clear: no strikes, no fires, no trouble. And almost overnight, the waterfront transformed. The chaos vanished and sabotage ceased. Ships loaded and departed without incident. For the U.S. government, it was a miracle. For Luciano, it was vindication. Even behind bars, he had proven that his influence was stronger than the law. As a reward, naval intelligence officials, embarrassed but grateful, quietly endorsed a recommendation for clemency. They described Luciano as cooperative, patriotic, and instrumental to wartime security. It was an astonishing reversal. The same man once condemned as the nation's greatest criminal was now being praised as a national asset. But for all his strategic victories, Luciano's years in prison also changed him. He began to read philosophy, biographies, and business theory. He studied Napoleon, Machiavelli, and even Henry Ford, men who, like him, built empires from nothing. Visitors noticed the difference. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something colder, more reflective. "Prison taught me patience," he told one journalist later. And patience is what keeps a man alive. He never complained, never asked for sympathy. To other inmates, he was proof that dignity could survive confinement. To the outside world, he became a legend, a living ghost haunting the edges of history. When the war ended in 1945, the political tide finally shifted. Dewey, now governor of New York, faced quiet pressure from military and intelligence circles. After months of debate, he agreed to commute Luciano's sentence, on the condition that he be deported to Italy. In February 1946, after nearly a decade in prison, Lucky Luciano walked out of Great Meadow Correctional Facility. Dressed in a gray suit and fedora, he looked less like a broken man and more like a statesman returning from exile. As reporters swarmed him, one shouted, "Lucky, what will you do now?" Luciano smiled faintly. "I'll do what I always do," he said. "I'll find the angles." Behind that line was a truth that no one in that crowd understood. He had learned how to rule from within walls, and that kind of power doesn't vanish with freedom. It deepens. Because even after prison, Lucky Luciano was still in control, not of streets or rackets but of a legacy, a myth, a code. His empire had survived bars and betrayal, and as he prepared to board the ship to Italy, he knew one thing for certain. He had turned confinement into command. After his deportation to Italy in 1946, Lucky Luciano's empire might have seemed finished, but he was far from done. Though stripped of his citizenship and exiled from the country he had once ruled, Luciano remained the quiet architect of the underworld. From his base in Naples, he reconnected with old allies and built new bridges, turning his exile into opportunity. He began managing drug routes through Europe, forming links between Sicilian suppliers and American distributors. Even from across the ocean, his influence stretched like an unseen web, delicate but powerful. Luciano lived under constant watch. Italian authorities trailed him, American agents monitored his mail, yet he continued to move pieces on the chessboard. He was no longer the king but the strategist behind the curtain. Old associates still sought his advice, and his name still carried weight. To many mobsters even in retirement he was il capo dei capi, the boss of bosses. But the years of control had taken their toll. The once unstoppable Luciano grew weary of isolation. He missed the pulse of New York, the skyline that had once symbolized his conquest. In private moments, he admitted to feeling betrayed by the very men he had elevated. They had prospered in his absence and few looked back. His power, once absolute, had turned into a memory of command. Yet Luciano never stopped scheming. In his final years he sought legitimacy, planning a film about his life, perhaps as a way to rewrite his story. He wanted to be remembered not as a criminal, but as a builder, a visionary who brought order to chaos. Fate, however, had other plans. In 1962, moments after meeting with a producer in Naples to discuss the project, he collapsed from a heart attack and died on the airport floor. His body was later returned to New York, the city that had made and destroyed him. Crowds gathered at his funeral, and even his enemies paid respect. In death as in life, Luciano commanded a strange kind of reverence, a mixture of fear, admiration, and awe. Lucky Luciano's exile ended not in disgrace but in legend. He had lost his empire, yet his name endured, a reminder that true power, once built, never really dies. Lucky Luciano's death in 1962 marked the end of an era, but his influence lived on, reshaping the criminal world long after he was gone. He was more than a mob boss, he was a strategist, the man who turned crime into a business. His creation of the Commission, a governing body that settled disputes and divided profits among families, ensured that organized crime would function like a corporation rather than a street gang. This innovation outlasted him, guiding generations of mobsters who followed his blueprint. Luciano's genius lay in understanding that survival depended on structure and discipline. Before him, the Mafia had been chaotic, ruled by emotion, revenge, and blood feuds. After him, it became systematic, pragmatic, and astonishingly efficient. Even law enforcement began to mimic his methods, studying his organizational models to dismantle them. Ironically, the government learned to fight the Mafia by thinking like Luciano himself. Culturally, his image became immortal. Films like The Godfather and Goodfellas borrowed from his philosophy, the calm, calculating Don who values loyalty over violence. He represented the modern criminal, intelligent, composed, and always 2 steps ahead. For many, Luciano became the dark symbol of the American dream corrupted, a poor immigrant who achieved success through control rather than chaos. Yet his legacy was not without cost. The same system he built, designed to create unity, eventually collapsed under greed, betrayal, and ambition. The Mafia wars of the later decades, the infiltration of narcotics, and the erosion of honor were all consequences of the machinery he created. Power, once shared, became contested. Loyalty, once sacred, became currency. Still, Luciano's shadow stretches across time. His methods inspired not only crime families in America but syndicates across the world. From the streets of New York to the docks of Naples, his principles endure: control, profit, and silence. He proved that power could be organized, and that order could exist even among thieves. In the end, Lucky Luciano's greatest legacy wasn't the empire he built, but the idea that crime could be managed like a business, efficient, disciplined, and unstoppable. His world may have fallen, but his blueprint never did. Lucky Luciano's story closes not with a gunshot, but with silence. The quiet ending of a man who once ruled the invisible kingdom of organized crime. When he died suddenly at the Naples airport in 1962, he was no longer the powerful Don of New York, but an exile, wealthy, aging and forgotten by most of the men who once swore loyalty to him. Yet even in death his shadow remained. Luciano's true legacy was never just in the crimes he committed, but in the system he created. He transformed chaos into structure, turning the Mafia into a disciplined corporation that outlasted its founders. The commission he designed became the blueprint for global organized crime, a council of balance, business and blood. His ideas outlived his body, influencing everything from the Cosa Nostra to modern criminal syndicates. But his story also exposes the paradox of power. The very loyalty Luciano used as his most dangerous weapon became his downfall. When loyalty is transactional, it never truly lasts. The empire he built on unity eventually fractured under greed and betrayal, proving that control built on fear can never survive forever. And yet, history refuses to bury him. Films, books, and documentaries keep reviving his legend, sometimes as a monster, sometimes as a visionary. He remains a mirror of human ambition, ruthless, intelligent, and deeply aware that power is only as real as the people who believe in it. In the end, Lucky Luciano's life is less about crime and more about the anatomy of control. He taught the world that true power doesn't come from violence, but from design, from understanding how men think, what they fear, and what they desire. That's why his name endures. Because every empire, legal or criminal, still follows the rules he wrote in the shadows.